Good evening. Thanks very much for coming tonight. What a wonderful, cool day. I can't believe it. The polar vortex from Canada cooled everything off. What a shock. I hope that doesn't happen every day, but especially in December. There were a couple of housekeeping things I wanted to address. You may have saw the slide. We're going to claim the PDUs for you. So if you write down your PDU number when you sign in, we'll claim that for you. The other thing I wanted to mention, as you probably know, our sponsor is the MBA program with a specialization in project management. And this Saturday at 10 a.m. here in this building, we have a info session, and it starts at 10 a.m. And we'd encourage you to go online. The website is project.utdallas.edu, and if you'd be so kind and register, then you'll get a very interesting presentation about the MBA program with a focus on project management. Do we offer lunch as well? You can stay and have lunch, and it's really good. And then after lunch, sometimes they let you go into some of the classes, is that right? Yeah, so you could be here for a couple hours and you get a really interesting tour and you'll have a much better understanding of the program. And of course, one of the benefits of the program is we have this free event 6 times a year. Remember, third Tuesday of the odd month. That's the only way I can remember how to show up here is it the third Tuesday of the odd month? Okay, our speaker tonight, Bob Vandehey. He's from California, and he still lives out there, but he's been in Dallas for a while now, so I guess he goes back and forth. He is a triathlete. He likes biking, music of all kind, and his claim to fame is he played in a band with Tommy Lee in Covina, California, before he became famous, of course. So let's give Bob a great hand.
Thank you. So it sounds really impressive, right? That I was in a band with Tommy Lee, right? You know, Motley Crue, tattoos. You know, you've seen the tapes maybe, or at least you've heard the tapes. Hopefully you haven't seen the tapes, right? And that's probably about everybody's vision of the band I was in with Tommy Lee, right? Unfortunately, it was that band. It was a marching band, so. That's him as a sophomore in high school. I went to school with him in Covina, California in the Royal Oak Marching Band. So awesome drummer. Never expected him to grow up to be a star that he was, but he played the drums all the time. So anyway, a little bit about me. As Renee said, I'm from California. I've lived there my whole life. For the last year and a few months, I've been living in Dallas. And I came out here to work with a startup company called Alchemy. And Alchemy is they've developed a internet digital banking application, just like you would see at Chase or Wells Fargo or other, but we sell it to the smaller financial institutions that can't afford to create their own. So I am the VP of Application Development there. Before that, I worked at a company called Rovi. They were entertainment company. Their big thing that I worked on was selling their digital data that they created, called their metadata, which, if you know anything about like IMDb, it's the data that drives like IMDb. It provides all of that content of what movies were on and who was in it and what channels are playing on and all that type of stuff. And I ran the team that provided the web services that allowed that content to be consumed by a bunch of different services. And before that, I worked at a company called Online Resources, where I developed 2 other banking applications similar to what I'm doing right now. So I've been in software development for over 20 years, most of that time in banking applications. For the last nearly 15 years, I've been doing some form of Agile, whether we'd call it XP in the beginning, whether we'd call it Scrum, as we're calling it now, or some other methods that we're going to talk about in here. I'm not a project manager. I've never been classically trained as a project manager. I have project managers that work for me. And I'm not a Scrum Master, although we have Scrum Masters that work for me too. So what I'm going to be talking about is real life experience of what I've seen that works and doesn't work in the area of Scrum. Okay? One of the mistakes I made when I was giving a presentation to a group of project managers from Germany was I assumed everybody knew what Scrum is. So to help prevent me from making that mistake twice, they didn't have any idea what Scrum was. They were project managers who worked in the auto industry, and there were whole other project management techniques that they use that I didn't even know about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Scrum is, and talk about the software development lifecycle. Maybe all of you aren't aware of what that is. I'm going to talk about how we started off in traditional waterfall, and talk about how Scrum is different than waterfall and why we're using Scrum and why Scrum works. Okay? So every software project, except for the most simplest, go through this software development lifecycle. All right, we go through a requirements phase where we determine out what we want to develop. We go through a design phase to figure out how do we take those requirements and turn them into some application. What architecture do we need to have that? What database do we need? What are the different screens and flow that we have in there? And then once we get all that design done, we go and do some development on it. We have QA that goes through and does testing on it. And then, we deploy it out to some environment, and then people start using it, and then they report bugs, and we do maintenance on it. So every program goes through this process. And typically, the only time you get any client input is at the beginning, when they're telling you what the requirements are and maybe looking at your design if you're lucky. And at the end, when they're actually using it and find there's problems and want you to fix it, right? So with this in mind, what they really came up with was a waterfall concept, where you do one thing, it flows into the next thing, it flows into the next thing, and it's called a waterfall because once you go to one phase to the other phase, it's really, you can't go back. It's like trying to swim upstream, and these are some salmon trying to swim upstream, and it's very hard to go back in the true waterfall method. So, like back in 1970, when they kind of like documented this process, I think it was Dr. Royce, Winston Royce, came out and documented this. He actually said the waterfall method really won't work for software development. It has to be more iterative. You have to go back to prior levels. That when you go through requirements and you get into design, you're going to find things out that are going to make you change your requirements and go back and have to rework them. You're going to have to go and start getting into development, you get in the weeds, you find out, well, we got to go back and change our design, and maybe that even then makes you go back and change your requirements. And then testing finds issues, which makes it go back to development, which makes you maybe go back to design. And so it is an iterative process. And even in 1970, when Royce wrote about this, he realized that it was an iterative process that needed to happen. Unfortunately, somewhere along the line, the iterative process got lost, and we came up with these very rigid waterfall concepts. So when I started programming in the 80s, we tried to do this. We tried to envision it like a construction project, which waterfall is used quite often. In fact, I remember sitting out almost every place I've ever worked, there was a building being built next door. And so I'd sit there and watch these buildings being built. And right now I'm up in Plano, and they've been building the Hilton right next to our building for the last year. And you watch, it's so systematic, right? They come in and you see people out there for, a couple months putting all these markers in and getting ready for the grading, and then the tractors come in and start leveling the ground. Then they start digging some footings and maybe pounding in some moors. And then come in the people that start laying the foundation, and they build on top of that. And it looks very systematic. And you go, that's the way software should be, right? We should be able to model this waterfall process. And the reason that we're having problems is because we're just not planning enough. We're not spending enough time up in requirements. We're not doing like they do in construction, where they go through and put together a nice architecture diagram of all the things they needed. So we need to go and spend more time in planning to get a better plan together and make sure there's no problems. Well, after nearly 30 years of doing this, it does not work. You just cannot plan enough. You cannot do enough. And now that we're in the age of the web and things are changing daily, by the time even if you could spend enough time drafting up all the requirements, the requirements have probably changed, right? So this worked really good when you're doing the space program, and they had 10 years, or at least maybe 8 or 9 years to do the space program, and the definition was really final what they needed, and there was a lot of science involved, and they could do that. But it doesn't work very good for the software projects we work on today, where it's a lot of web development, the businesses is changing their mind daily. The market maybe is changing their mind very often, and you got to react really quickly to capitalize on that market. Not to mention you've maybe got bugs and issues that come out that drive your requirements and change, and you got to react really quickly. And so, here in requirements, you had product managers and customers. So the other thing you had about waterfall, right, you had different people involved in different aspects of it, right? So in requirements, you had product managers and customers talking about it. In design, you had analysts and architects going through and laying out the design. In development, you had engineers and developers doing that part of it. In testing, you had QA. And in deployment, you had your operations team doing it. And then in maintenance, you had your support team. So there was always different people in every aspect of that. And so there wasn't any flow and continuity between the different things. So, the people who wrote the requirements passed it over the line, and design people took what they had and tried to create it. And very rarely did the two groups talk all that much. Okay? And the outcome of the waterfall method was these project plans that if you're a project manager, you're very well aware of, right? This is your life of what you create and lay out a very simple, a very detailed and complex project plan. And you've gone through an estimation process that you hopefully have defined all the things you need and plan for enough scope in it, plan for enough resources that you can deliver it on the time that you said you're going to do it. The reality is, most projects were not delivered on the time that they said they were going to be delivered to. Most projects were always much later than they were. There were things that you found out, and it caused projects just to always be late. Everybody was upset, cost overruns all the time. So the industry started thinking there's got to be a better way. How do I solve this problem? And one of the methods they came up with was Scrum, right? And Scrum changes that model completely. What we have instead is a team that all works together. So when I showed you on the waterfall method that you had the product managers and the designers and the architects and the developers and the QA and the operations all in separated teams, this now creates a team with all the people that you need together on that. And ideally, they're small teams. Typically, ideal team size is 7, but 5 to 9 is a good size. And those people work together to identify what the backlog is. So the product owner, he goes through and defines what the requirements are from the customers and stakeholders and the users of this product. They come up with a list of items that need to be done. These lists are ordered by business value. Like what the most important things to the business are put at the top of the list. And then these are broken down into what are called stories. And the stories are just basically a very simple requirement that you can do. And then what happens is these stories go in the backlog, and then you go into a planning meeting. And so the whole team comes into a planning meeting, you look at the backlog, and you try and say, okay, in the next iteration that we're doing, and I'm going to say it's 3 weeks, because our sprints that we did were 3 weeks. This next iteration that we're doing for 3 weeks, what can we finish? And we go through and pick all the items from that list that we can finish, and we commit to those in what's called our sprint. So we have a 3-week sprint that we're committing to all of these features. And the promise is that at the end of this 3-week period, I'm going to deliver a shippable product, or at least a potentially shippable product. They might not necessarily install it anywhere, but it should be able to work, be demoable, and could be installed if we really needed it to. Right? So we select all the things that we commit to in that. Then we go down and we estimate those, by the way, too. So we go through and we use, a lot of people, we do kind of like a poker where you have different cards of different values, and that represents the complexity of that item, and you give them points. And those points are assigned to these stories that you are then working. And those points are used to track what's called a velocity, right? So a velocity is, as from sprint to sprint to sprint, I can track how many points of business value I did in each sprint. And, so if I did 100 points here and maybe 110 points here and 105 points here, my velocity would basically be about 105 points. And so that allows me then to forecast forward that, okay, if we do about 105 points every sprint, I can see the things we have on our backlog and what their points values are, and I can kind of like estimate when things are going to be delivered, right? And then what we do is once we decide what's going to be in the sprint, then the team starts breaking it down into what. So I've got this very high-level requirement that I need to do called a story, but there's maybe a bunch of tasks that I need to do. Maybe I need to design a database. Maybe I need to design some object hierarchy. Maybe I need to design some data access layer. Maybe I need to design some UI screens. So once I have all those tasks broken down, I go in and I estimate the hours on those tasks. And then when I'm done estimating the hours, I know the total hours that it's going to take for all of my developers to do all this work. And hopefully those hours match the capacity of the number of people I have on the team that actually do work. All right? And if we don't, then you have another problem. You go back and replan, maybe take some things out and make your requirements less. Okay? But then we start the sprint. And when you start the sprint, the promise is to the business by the team is that by the end of the sprint, I am going to deliver everything I promised to you. Right? And so we go through a sprint, and that's what that cycle is there. We do 3-week sprints. And then every day, we go into what's called a stand-up meeting. And in that stand-up meeting, it's typically led by the Scrum Master. We typically show some burn-down charts that show how close you are to meeting the goal of delivering this on time. So it tracks, the number of hours that we've actually worked on it, and how many hours we have left and how much time we have left. So, up in the little corner there, it shows the line going down, that if everything's going good, as you're progressing through the sprint, you are burning it down and getting closer to the end. And when you get to the end, hopefully all the hours are burned down, you're done with the project, it can go out as a new release. But in those daily meetings, we talk about 3 things. We talked about what you worked on yesterday. We talked about what you're going to work on tomorrow. What you're going to work on today. And if you have anything that's preventing you from finishing your work. So you have some type of a blocker. So if you have a blocker, then we're going to address what that blocker is, how we can unblock you and get you to move along. And that happens every day, and it's led by the Scrum Master. And throughout this whole process, we come out with some version at the very end that we can deliver, could be installed. And then we have a review process where we go through and review the sprint, and then we're going to do what's a retrospective. So the review just says, okay, this is what we've delivered, these are the things that we've gotten done, and the sprint retrospective is another meeting where we go and say, what could we have done better? So the whole point of Scrum is everything's iterative, even how do I improve after each sprint? How do I get better for the next sprint? What did we do good and we want to continue to do? What did we do bad that we want to stop doing and improve upon? And some of those things that, are typically bad things that we do in a sprint are, maybe the requirements weren't clear, so we need better requirements up front. Maybe it wasn't clear what the priorities are. Maybe we had blockers because we were waiting for some interface or connection to be done. Those are all the types of things that we have, and we try and figure out how can we do it better next time. Anybody have any questions on that before I move on? Yeah. What does Scrum stand for? It doesn't stand, it's not an acronym. The concept is it's taken from rugby. So you got a bunch of people, in rugby around in a scrum, and the point is in rugby, they're all together. We're all in this together. So it's kind of like how that's gotten, they got that name. Okay? Yeah?
If you're building a banking system, way up front, where you're talking to the client and the product owner is talking to the client, I can imagine you'd come up with about 100 different stories.
At least.
And you would be listing those stories down, and there's generally some implied order. That's what I think of as, writing the book and having the chapters and trying to figure out what the book's going to look like before you start to write each chapter and then tell the story.
Sure.
In all of the information that I've seen on Agile or Scrum, they never talk very much about that part of the process, which to me is complex.
Right. So, well, first of all, I'm going to go back. I should say the question in case you can't hear it. So the first question was, what was Scrum? So Scrum, came out of rugby. This question really is so you start off a project with like a banking system with a bunch of requirements, and potentially hundreds or more requirements, how do you start off the project? How do you boil this down? How do you prioritize, and what do you do? Is that correct stating that? Okay. So, the other thing, going up, there's different levels of detail that you start off with. So we call the very top, we have features that we want to do, right? So we know that we want to do account presentment, so you can go and see what accounts you have. We want to be able to transfer money. We want to be able to pay your bills. We want to be able to view your transactions, and you want to view your statements. We do a lot more, but let's just take those as maybe the top 5. And so we would create those as maybe features. Within those features, we then create epics. And epics are, a large swath of functionality that we want. So maybe in bill pay, we want one of the epics would be to be able to add a payee, right? So I've got to pay a bill, I've got to add a payee. And then maybe another one of the epics is I got to be able to delete a payee. And maybe another one of the epics is I got to pay a bill. And so we would have them in the backlog. The product manager's job is to go through and start identifying what those big things are. And when you start a project, you might have only done a small portion of defining what you're really working on. But the product manager usually has a vision, and he starts working towards it, and he starts working up at this very broad range and start putting up with these features and epics. And then he starts saying, okay, we're going to start on this particular feature with these epics in it, and we're going to pick this epic, and I'm going to start adding stories in there. And that's what the team starts working on. We start working on the stories that they start to find the best. And so, our development process for the Alchemy product started about 4 years ago. And so, this was a process that they were going through in the beginning of working on a feature at a time to get it to now where our product is a fully functional product with things all over. Now the type of stories we have, it's much easier because our stories are now customer driven. We go out and sell to a customer, they have some new features. That drives our epics and stories that we do right now. But at the beginning, you're right, there's a whole bunch of stuff we'd have to address. Yeah.
Sounds like you've been influenced by Hollywood. But no, the product owner and the Scrum Master, are those the same individuals?
They can be. They're usually not, but they can be. The product owner, that's in our case, that's our product manager. He's the one who understands the product. He talks to the customer. He understands what he needs to do, what the customers want, what the market will pay for that feature. Is there money to be made, and pricing and all that type of stuff. And that's what our product manager does. The Scrum Master, in our case, is really just one of the persons, a technical lead on the team that runs as a Scrum Master. But I've seen them being both the same person. Many times, when I worked at Rovi, we had project managers who were Scrum Masters. So as part of one of the teams, their whole function was just to be a Scrum Master. But one of the things I'll show a little bit later on is how complex it can get in large enterprises like Rovi, and why you really need project managers to manage that complexity. Yeah.
For the product backlog, when you're trying to go between assessing how many hours of all the tasks that comprise a story, converting that to points, in your experience, have you seen a direct mathematical relationship like 80 hours is 8 points or something like that?
Well, so we don't convert hours to points. Points are really supposed to be complexity. And, there's a lot of argument, even within our organization, about you really try and separate hours from points. It's hard to do, but you try and do. It's really relative complexity. So if I worked on something else, and let's just call that something else I worked on a 5, right? Is the one you're working on harder or easier than the one you worked on? Right? If it's easier, we're going to call it a 3. Most people use the Fibonacci scale when you estimate in Scrum. So it starts at 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, something like that, right? And the reason being is you've got enough room between the numbers that I don't have to worry, is it a 5 or a 6 or a 7, right? It's either a 3, a 5, or an 8, right? And try and pick the relative complexity. Relatives to something else that you can have, and all kind of like agree on what that relative complexity is. It doesn't really necessarily, at some point complexity probably equates to hours, right? But when you're doing the estimation point, the point is to try and boil it down to just relative complexity. After we do the point estimation is happening up here at the product backlog, and then when we break it down, that's when we do the hours. And at that point, we're breaking it down into finer grained tasks. That is easier for a developer to try and estimate the number of hours in that task. It's very hard when you look at, there's maybe a dozen things I have to do and how many hours, but when you start actually breaking down these tasks, you do a better job of it. And then one of the things that most companies practicing Scrum do is you re-estimate every day. So our developers, they go in, they start on a task, and maybe they originally estimated that this task is going to take 10 hours. They've now spent the whole day working on it, and 6 hours, maybe they spent 6 hours of that day working on it. And so the logic would say, well, if I estimated 10, I've worked 6, I've got 4 left. But maybe as they've got into it, it got more and more complex, and they realize there's more work that needs to be done. And so at the end of every day, when they enter the number of hours they worked on it, they also have to re-estimate what's left. And so they'll go in and say, okay, well, I worked 6, but really, there's 12 hours left, right? So it's actually gone up. And when you look at your burn down chart up there, when that happens, the line goes up, not down. It means you've added more work, not down. And it's through the burn down charts that you can see whether your project's in trouble or not, and you can find out pretty early if we're going to make the delivery or not. And if we're not going to make the delivery, we start communicating with the product manager, or the product owner in this case, of what we need to do to maybe start eliminating some scope, taking things away, so that we still meet the goal of at the end of this process we have a shippable product, a potentially shippable product. Yeah.
From the daily stand-ups perspective, do you think getting business owners or business users to your meetings adds value?
So I heard from the you're talking about, do the product owner and the business owners, do they come to the meetings, the daily stand-ups?
You have business representatives.
We do. Right, so we do. The product manager, the product owner doesn't come to every meeting, and true Scrum they would, right? But he's got a lot of other responsibilities, but he comes to a lot of the meetings. And as we'll talk about in our process, we actually are having a modified Scrum process anyway. So we have a lot of interaction all throughout the day with the product owner on anything that we need direction from. But in a true, good working Scrum team, yes, the product owner would come. The business owners, if they're not actually part of the official Scrum team, they typically would not participate. They can come, but they don't really participate. And there's an analogy out there that you have chickens and pigs, right? Which one is committed for breakfast, right? So the chicken can deliver an egg and deliver another egg tomorrow, right? So the business owners are chickens because they're not really committed to this project. They may be paying the bills, but they don't have any skin in the game that if we don't deliver at the end of this sprint, they get to go home and sleep at night. Whereas all the people on the Scrum team, they've committed to delivering this. And that means if I'm running behind, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to deliver it. And so that's why they're called pigs, is they give their life to this project, right? So, yes?
Just to confirm, the product backlog, you mentioned point system drives is based on complexity or priority?
It's based on complexity. But the ordering is based on priority, right? So we estimate how complex they are and give them a point, but they're ordered based on priority. So there are things that I might want at the top. Maybe they're hard or maybe they're easy. That's really beside the point. Ideally, it's ranked by business value, that getting this feature into production or into customers' hands early will make the company money, or at least make the customer happy or something like that, right? Okay. One more question I got to get on. Go ahead.
Sprint end date and team deliverables do not change. I understand the sprint end date part. The team deliverable, if the team did not do the math right initially, and if they slip, how do we handle that?
So the question is, if the team misestimated the amount that they can deliver, and they're not going to be able to deliver all that they committed to, how do you handle that? Well, it's just like really any project. You got to go back and determine what can we cut. If we're not going to deliver it all, and there's no way that they can actually make up that time and get it in there, and work their nights and weekends and whatever IT people do, you got to go back to the product owner and say, we have an issue, we're running low. Are there stories that we can cut? Maybe are there tasks that we can do? Can we redefine what the definition of done is in this sprint to meet a requirement? You don't like to do that, but that is one of the problems. So after I go through here, we're going to be talking about some of the problems that you have with sprints, Scrum. Okay? All right. Thank you. Good questions. So I guess the deliverable out of a waterfall was the project plan, but typically the tool that you use in Scrum is this Scrum board. And so the bottom shows, you have a none column where that's your work that's ready to start. And at the beginning of the sprint, everything's in none. And then what happens is the developer takes a story, they put it over into the ready to develop, and they start working on everything. And then they move it over to in progress when they're actually working on it. And then when they're done, they're ready for QA testing. And so then QA starts testing it. And when QA accepts it, it moves over to the accepted. And this is the board that we all have up. Ours is a little bit different. We have different columns for that. We have more columns. But the idea is that you have a board of things that progress from the left to the right, and the developers are moving them. They're assigning it to themselves. They're moving it through the process, and they're all working as a team together, all of the people, whether they're architects, developers, QA, product owners, all of them working together to deliver this on time and doing whatever needs to be done. Up at the top left, we got the burn down chart that shows what they're burning down. You've got the gray line, which is the ideal line, and the red line is really what's left to do. And ideally, the two line up. They usually don't. Usually at the beginning, the line almost always goes up as you identify more and more work. And then as you go down, hopefully somewhere before the last few days, you cross over the gray line and get down below and that. And then the graph on the right side, that's a cumulative flow, is how are things moving through the system from the standpoint of their status in these columns, right? So everything will start off on gray, or start off on none, which is not even showed here, and then blue is the next, and so on. Okay? So why Scrum works, right? Well, it's an empirical process. Right? It's not a defined process. So a waterfall method is a defined process. It works for manufacturing and construction, where you know really exactly what you're going to do. The construction project works because we've done construction for a lot of years. There's a lot of existing patterns that we need to do. And they know the defined process. They can work that out. Once the architect comes up with this plan, it's easy to break that down into concrete tasks that you need to do and define that process. If you're building a car, it's easy to define what the process is of that car, right? And then it's an assembly line, it's a process of just following through that process. But in software development, it's an empirical process. You can't really define at the beginning all the little things that you have to do to make this application work properly. And you discover that as you go through the process, you start learning what it is. And it's an iterative process that as you get in deeper and deeper and you learn more and more and more, and that adds to your understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve. And so it's an empirical process, and Scrum supports an empirical process. Right? It allows an iterative back and forth. It allows you to talk to the business owner to get more understanding of the requirements instead of them passing it down to the next person, and maybe you don't even have a way to talk to that person. So that's one of the main reasons why it works. It controls and time boxes change to the length of a sprint, right? So one of the things that frustrates developers is, changing priorities, right? You come in every day and, you thought you were working on this and some problem comes up and you're now working on this. Well, the whole concept of Scrum is once you plan it and you guarantee, that is pretty much set for the duration of that sprint period. And it shouldn't change. It can change, but it shouldn't change. And change should be painful in that case. And so that controls the inputs of what you're working on. And then at time boxes, you only have 3 weeks, the length of your sprint, to work on these things. And so that time boxes things. So, many times, every project that I've ever done in software development, no matter how good you try and estimate it, every project always fills up all the time that you've ever planned and then the buffer you added, and then some, right? It's always that way. I don't care how much you go, you're going to say, I'm going to buffer it 50%, so it's more than I ever need. You're always going to use that 50% and then another 10 or 20% on top of that, right? Well, the concept here is this is a time box. You got 3 weeks, guys. You get what we can done in there, and that's our time box, right? And the Scrum team is committed to delivering a potentially shippable product at the end of a sprint. You know, the problem with waterfall is, you know, those length of a project can go on for a long time. And the time from where you start finding the requirements to where it actually gets installed down in operations in some place where it actually works is a long time. It could be easily weeks, months, sometimes on big projects even years. And the problem is you don't find out all the problems you have in installing the product until, you know, you're down in the deployment phase and you find all these issues and problems that you need to go back, and it just causes a whole bunch of time. Every sprint, the team is going through that whole cycle. They're learning the things that work and the things that don't work. They're deploying this out to some place where it can actually run and operate. When they find out it's painful, and developers hate painful things, they hate doing manual things, so with every week they've got to do this process, or every sprint they got to do this process, they're going to start automating things and finding easier way of doing things and making it less painful for them so they can get back to coding, which is what developers love to do, right? And so with a team committed to delivering this, at the end of every cycle, they go through this whole thing all the time. They do the integration that needs to be done to third-party systems, which in most waterfall things is done at the very end of the process and becomes a very costly process. Okay? You know, and it breaks up the complexity into more manageable chunks. You know, one of the questions was asked is how at the beginning do you define all of this and manage all that complexity? Well, as I said, you know, we define it into small little chunks. It comes in iteratively into our planning meeting, and then we work on that in smaller chunks. Whereas when you work in a waterfall, you got all the requirements, and you got this big, huge requirements document that's thrown on your desk, and you got to go in and try and figure it all out, and you spend months going in there, and developers hate reading those things anyway, so they miss some things, and you don't find that out until later. This is much more smaller chunks, easier to deliver. Developers work good when you can give them small little things to work on. And then there's ownership and autonomy, right? So the team owns this. They own the process, they own the product, they own the delivery, they own everything, and they're also autonomous. Everybody who needs to make a decision should be on the Scrum team. So you got the product owner there, you have a question, you ask the product owner, they're gonna answer the question very quickly, and so you're autonomous and can get things done, okay? Unfortunately, Scrum has its problems, and I've experienced this every place I've tried to implement Scrum. The Scrum purists would argue that I'm just not doing Scrum right. I've tried. I've paid consultants. I've had people out. I've tried. But it's hard. At Alchemy, when we launched our product, so we spent about 3 years developing this product. We get our first customer. We install the product. I think we got everything right, and then lo and behold, we don't have everything right. There's things that aren't working, there's features that are missing, the customer is wanting new things added in there really quick. Well, meanwhile, the development team is on to their next sprint. They think they're done. Right? They delivered what they thought was their shippable product that they needed to deliver. And unfortunately, the customer that this actually got installed on didn't really see the product in its entirety until it was actually installed. And so then that brought up a whole bunch of things that we need to fix and change and improve. And so, the thing was, when they started bringing all these things, we're in the middle of a sprint, guys. Sorry, come back in 3 weeks when we're done with the sprint, right? Customers don't like that when they have a problem and you tell them come back in 3 weeks. And not only is it come back in 3 weeks, but I'm just going to start planning for that change in the next sprint, and I'll deliver it 3 weeks after that. So it's really 6 weeks that I'm going to deliver it to you, not tomorrow when the customer wants it. And that's a problem, right? So, managing chaos and uncertainty doesn't work very good with the Scrum process. It works very good, especially in the early stages of the company where we don't have a customer yet, And we can work through very methodically on planning this out and control what we need to do. But as soon as you get your first customer, all bets are off. The customer is now driving what you need to do, and you can't push back and just say, I'm sorry guys, I'm in the middle of a sprint, you're going to have to wait, right? Right?
So what you're saying is support teams and development teams are going to be different?
Support teams and development teams do what?
Are going to be different for Scrum?
Well, yeah, so our support team does not do Scrum. They can do Scrum, but they don't do Scrum. But the support team, they get issues that are reported to them. Our support team does not fix the issues typically. I mean, they do if it's like a data problem and you can go into a database, or maybe it's a configuration problem and they can fix a configuration. But our support team does not change code, right? But that actually goes to the answer to how we solve this problem, right? Is we needed another team. So we needed what we called our SWAT team. And we came up with a SWAT process. And we took out people from the Scrum process who were on the SWAT process. And this one, the product owner of this became the VP of services, not our product owner, right? The product owner is worrying about our roadmap of features we need to develop to, make to get new business and that. Whereas the VP of services, he's responsible for making the customers we've sold happy, that the product that we have sold them gets implemented and is working properly. So he's responsible for that. So we've gave him the responsibility of prioritizing a queue of work that needs to be done. And then we have the director of QA and release management managing that list. It's kind of like almost the Scrum Master meeting with the team daily. And then continuously, they work through these issues. So there is no sprint, there is no commitment, there is just a queue of things that we work through, that they work through every day, day in and day out, trying to get through this queue. And what we do is if we find out that there's more work than the people we've assigned, we'll assign more people to that, so we burn them down faster. If we find we have many people on that, as our product matures, we're going to hopefully find we have too many people and we'll be able to move them back into Scrum teams. And then what they do is they manage all the different releases. So we have different customers on different versions of the application, and we'll have to maybe if somebody's on like 6.0.12 and they report a bug, we've got to hotfix 6.0.12 and get it out there for them. So they manage all those complexities, making sure they get merged into the appropriate branches and handle that whole process. So if you're faced with uncertainty and chaos, you're just going to frustrate yourself if you try and manage that into the Scrum process. So I would tell you, develop another team to handle that chaos. Okay? The second problem is large teams. So at Rovi, we had, it's a couple thousand employee company with divisions all over the world. And one of the team projects I worked on was this metadata services that got used by set-top boxes, like your cable box, got used by iPads and Android devices, got used by smart TVs, and got used by web pages, delivered TV guide type experience and stuff. And my services were used by all of these different devices. We had a sales team going out and selling these products, and we had trade shows that we would go to all over the world and show them our future products. So the problem comes if you're working on a Scrum team and the size of your Scrum team is supposed to be, 5 to 9 people. Well, obviously we had hundreds of people working on this product all over the world, and how do you do that? Within Alchemy right now, we'll soon have 40 developers on my team, and that's obviously more than I can handle on a Scrum team, even if I take some and put them on the SWAT team, right? So how do you handle that? Right? Well, you have to divide into smaller teams, and then you do what's called the Scrum of Scrums, right? You divide into small teams. So, when you divide into a small team, it creates its own share of problems, right? Sometimes you have the same resource on multiple teams. So maybe you have the product manager or the product owner. In our case, he would be on multiple different teams, helping them understand their backlog and working on them. Sometimes you lose the lack of unified product and vision that you have across all the different teams. Like, how do they state the vision the same, that this is our common goal? How do you prevent multiple different teams that are maybe working on the same code base from duplicating and providing redundancy? and then communication failures that happen. Now you're no longer all in the same stand-up meeting every day. You're now, off in your own stand-ups doing different things. And then integration hell, trying to take all these different pieces of all these different teams working and integrate it all together. And then, of course, the dependencies of tasks between different teams and stuff is complex, right? So, the Scrum of Scrums is what the way you solve this problem, right? And that is where you have a daily meeting with representatives from each Scrum team. So if I have 10 Scrum teams out there all working on their own, I would have maybe 10 representatives come down into another meeting, or maybe I'll have, they have what's called a Scrum of Scrums, right? It can get infinitely complex, but where the goal is that you have representatives from each of those Scrum groups come, have a meeting, and talk about the high-level things that happen in each thing, and what each team is planning to do, what each team did yesterday, what each team is planning to do today, and what blockers that team has to the rest of the group. Okay? One of the things to make this work is ideally you organize a Scrum meeting sequentially. So I'm really looking at this from Alchemy standpoint. Like I said, we're going to soon have 40 people, and I'm going to need to have more Scrums going on. And so, I have same product owner in all of the meetings, and I need to break it up a little bit. So, you time box each stand-up to 15 minutes, and then you do them sequentially, flow one after the other, and then you end the meeting with a Scrum of Scrums, where everybody gets together from all those different meetings and talks about what's gone on. Yes?
Sprints all the same? They're all on the same sprint?
Well, that's actually the next thing, right? Okay. So yes. So they don't necessarily all have to be the same length, but they all at some point have to align, and you align your releases to where those align. So the example here shows that the Gamma team, they're on 1-week sprints. The Beta team is on 4-week sprints, and the Alpha team's on 2-week sprints. So, but we can line up every 4 weeks to do a release. And if we exclude the Beta team, we can actually do a release every 2 weeks, right? So just depends how it works, what works for you. But at some point, they have to all align so you can finish, cut off, do testing, integration, release, and ship that product. Okay. Any questions there? Yes?
You're including integration tests as part of the 3-week Scrum?
Well, not in this case, no. But in the normal case of our Scrum, it is, when we're done, it is fully working and integrated with whatever third-party systems we have, yes. Yeah, has to.
And if you find anomaly defects, that goes into the next sprint then?
Well, it all depends. So hopefully you're not doing your integration at the very last day, right? So that's one of the reasons we do 3-week sprints instead of 2-week sprints. So it's really 2 weeks of work and 1 week of integration and testing, right? So, okay, good question. All right, so, so Scrum solves that problem. So problem number 3, this is probably where I get probably the most argument from true Scrum people. How do you get predictability of scheduling costs? So if there's very few businesses that I know today, and there's very few CFOs that will write a check when you go and tell them, well, I don't know how long this is going to take, but I'll tell you maybe what I'll get done in the next 3 weeks. Maybe I'll tell you what I'll get done in the next 6 weeks, but beyond that, I have no idea, so I'm not going to tell you, right? That sounds great, but the reality is businesses do not work that way, especially enterprise businesses do not work that way. And that's why they have project managers, right, to go and identify, what are the things we need to do, what are the resources we need, what are the constraints that we have, and how much is this going to cost me, right? So Scrum says, sorry, I'm only going to give you maybe at most two sprints out visibility on that. And then the other issue is dependency on different groups. I talked about at Rovi, we had a lot of different groups involved in all of these things that were happening. We had marketing and legal, we had IT and sales, we had operations, development. They all had their different things going on and handling it. And, Scrum really just works on kind of like this little island, and it gets really complex when you have all these different stakeholders involved. It's very hard. And so the answer that I say, the only way that I know to solve this is you have to do both. And the Scrum purists are going to hate this. They're going to argue with you. When you try and implement this, they're going to say, no, you can't go and estimate this because we've proven that project plans are just inaccurate. And why am I going to waste my time doing something that I know is not accurate? But you've got to have a plan, right? That's like saying I'm going to go across the United States. I don't have a roadmap, right? Maybe your plan might change. Maybe I'm going to use more gas than I anticipate. Maybe I'm going to go faster or slower than I expected. But I darn well better have somewhat of a map routed out of where I want to go and how I want to get there so that I have some plan. And so this is what this is. You've got to go through the exercise of planning it out. You've got to go through and figure out what those high-level tasks are. You've got to go through and provide some type of estimates, and you've got to go through and provide some type of estimate on resources that you're going to use on this team to come up with some plan that you can present to the decision maker that they can approve this project and move on. And then the job of the project manager is to go through and track to this plan and communicate back to the business owner whether we're meeting this or not, and then do the typical thing that you do in the iron triangle is, do we need more money, do I need more time, or do I take away some features, right? So I say do both, right? Okay? So in summary, Scrum solves many of the problems of software development by using an iterative, empirical process. But I say you can't be dogmatic on Scrum. You've got to develop an agile process that meets your needs and adapts to your business requirements. If you listen to the Scrum coaches out there they're going to come in, they're going to blame all the problems that you have in your business to you're not doing Scrum right. And if you just do Scrum right, you're going to solve all your problems. And I wish that was true. I really wish that was true. And maybe one day the right Scrum coach is going to come in and prove me wrong. But my knowledge today of being in this business is you have to adapt to what works in your case. Right? And if you have a lot of chaos in your environment, Scrum may not be the best choice. So either control the chaos or change the process to accommodate the chaos. And so, I've been talking about Scrum, and the reality is we are actually not doing Scrum today at Alchemy. So we were doing Scrum, and it was the most frustrating thing that we could ever have because of the chaos I talked earlier. And so I told you we created the SWAT team that started working on, more of this workflow process, which, kind of like we call it Kanban-ish. Right? There's another process out there called Kanban that's started by Toyota. There's a software development process called Kanban, but we're not true Kanban, so we call it Kanban-ish. So I've coined that term, so now it's on tape. Kanban-ish, that's my term. So when the SWAT team started doing the other process, we actually realized that process works so much better for our environment than the Scrum process. And so right now, actually, all of our teams are doing the Kanban-ish process. So we do have a meeting in a couple of weeks where I'm going to talk and say, is it time to change back to doing Scrum for the non-SWAT stuff? But actually, it's been working very good. The business is happy. Back when we were doing Scrum, the business wasn't happy. They were very upset. They were frustrated. They weren't getting what we needed. Customers were not getting launched. Customers were getting ready to cancel their contracts. And when we moved to the Kanban-ish process, things just started flowing through the systems. We started prioritizing the things that solve customers' problems. And it made the developer's life happy because, the way it was happening when we were trying to do Scrum is it seemed like every day, we'd go through a planning process, and right after we got out of the planning process, it got, oh my God, we're waiting for you to finish. You finally finished because we got some changes we need to do, right? So no sooner did we come out of the meeting and they're already changing it. And it was just a constant turmoil of change and stuff. And to try and control that and push back on the business was just frustrating them and frustrating our customers and frustrating the developers because of all this change. Now the developers, they just go to the queue, they see the next thing on the list, they pull it off the list and they work on it. The product owners just go and prioritize the list, so if they want something done right away, they put it at the top of the list and they know the next developer is just going to pull it off and start working on it. It goes right through the system, so we look at it as like an inventory system. We've got all this inventory, you can prioritize that inventory, we'll work through this inventory as fast as we can and move it through the system. And we're also moving on what's called a continuous deployment process, so As soon as it's done and accepted, it can go out to an environment, and we've got all of that automated. It's all flowing very good, and we're very happy with it right now. So, yes?
I think the original problem was, if you go back 40 years or more, you don't understand my requirements, you don't plan very well, and so whatever you build is not very good. And I think you need a very sophisticated organization to move to this process. And I can see Kanban working well because the business sees you focused on a business process that they understand. And then you're moving from Kanban to, a Scrum where you're saying, take a piece of this process that the business is blessed.
Right.
Now go figure it out.
Right.
And so by merging the two of them together, you're sort of achieving kind of the best of both worlds.
I think so, yeah. If you didn't hear everything he said, basically that, we have combined the best of the both worlds of Kanban and Scrum, and got a process that works really good for us. And, if you're, if maybe your organization is maybe, what you said, more mature, is that what you said was?
No, I say you need a pretty sophisticated organization.
A sophisticated organization,
Where
yes.
the management is sophisticated
Right.
enough to understand the management.
Right, yeah. Yes?
So one concern I have with the Scrum process is it feels like you're constantly setting people up for burnout. Like, okay, we all know engineers underestimate stuff, right? So you go in, you pick your thing, you estimate, yeah, that'll fit in. Then we get to the end of the 3 weeks. Oh my gosh, it's not done yet. You're working nights, weekends, you're getting it done so we can have our party after this whole thing is over, right? And then start it all over again.
Right. Well, there are blogs out there that do talk about that Scrum can lead to burnout. But actually, Scrum was designed to by developers to try and alleviate that problem, right? So if I'm working late at night because I didn't get it done, because we're notoriously bad at estimating, well, in my retrospective that I do, we're going to say, hey guys, we need to do a little better job of estimating next time, or we need to commit to less stuff, right? Because developers want to get their life back. And so we started getting into Scrum because it kind of like gave the promise of getting our life back. And so the true Scrums would say you're estimating wrong, you'll learn over time, you'll get better, and you'll get your life back if you do it long enough, right? But the process that we have now is one of the criticisms of the Kanban or the Kanban-ish process is that maybe it doesn't provide enough pressure, right? Because with the concept of a Scrum, you've got that 3-week pressure of stuff you've committed. If I got a queue of works that I need to do, where is the pressure? I just go and take the next thing. If that takes me an hour or a week, so be it, right? We've got 30, 40 people doing work on it. How will I even notice? And the reality is, in our case, we breed an environment of performance, right? That you feel internally the need to do things fast, but right. One of the criticisms of Scrum is sometimes it's telling you that I've got to constrain, so I might not do it right. And so then what you do is you start entering a lot of debt into your system, technical debt, and then you start creating issues that say, oh, I got to fix this technical debt in the future because I didn't have time to do it in this sprint. And many times you never get to that technical debt because you've got other things that go in. The product manager, he doesn't care about your technical debt. He cares about the feature that he promised to the customer. Well, our job is that when you do this task, we want you to do it fast, but you want to do it right. And if there's debt that's being introduced by that, well, fix the debt right there at that time. And if it takes a little bit longer, it takes a little bit longer. It's better than getting in debt and getting behind the 8 ball on it. And as far as addressing the whether we're getting the performance we need, we still estimate all the things we work on, all the stories we work on. We still estimate it. We can go through and calculate velocity. We can see who's doing the highest velocity work and who's not, and who's maybe shirking their responsibility, whatever. So we can do metrics to try and alleviate the concerns that people have with doing Kanban-ish. Okay. It's 7:30, so that's my time's up. And you want to go longer? It's up to you. I'm fine, so go ahead.
When I go to some of the PMI dinner meetings and sit around the table, I ask a lot of times who the agile PMs are. And then my next question is, are you 100% agile or are you a hybrid? I would say at least 50% of them are a hybrid of waterfall and agile.
Right. Well, absolutely. And in fact, that's what I was showing there. I mean, I think really to be a project manager in anything but maybe smaller organizations, you have to be both. You have to use elements of both things in there. And I know the purists will say that's wrong, but you have to. I mean...
Yeah. But I think one of the reasons they're pushed on that is that upper management still has trouble letting go of waterfall in that they want two things. When can I have it and how much it's going to cost?
I know, but how do you tell a business that you can't, right? You can't go to a business and say, I'm sorry, you know, I'll give it to you when I can, I'll do the best job I can, but I don't know, I can't tell you. There's businesses do not work that way. You know, you're not going to get the bean counters to release some beans if you do that. Yeah.
As an end user consumer, I'm noticing, especially a lot of web-based software applications, I feel like I'm a beta tester. By default, automatically, whenever anything new comes out.
Sure.
Compared to the 90s, you know, we got everything on disk.
Sure.
Yeah. Are you noticing that businesses are doing that purposely more and more? And what percentage complete does your software have to be before you do release it to the end user?
Okay. So the question is back in the 80s and 90s when we actually had to release something on disk, the quality of the product was actually better than today where we're releasing it online. The quality, he feels like a beta tester because every time a release comes out, you have problems, right? That is the world that we live in now, though. Because the thing that we work on, it's hard to QA everything, especially in our product. I mean, we have multiple different customers. Every customer has a completely different configuration. They talk to completely different third-party systems. So this integration problem that we have, every single customer has these integration problems. And it's a hard problem for us to be able to test all of that adequately with the pace that we're moving on. And we don't have the time to lock down for 3 months to go through a full regression test cycle to test everything. So we realize we're not going to test everything that we can test. And yes, it's a conscious decision that we are going to test the most high value, important things and do the best job we can. But just as we release quick, we fix quick. And as soon as we notice a problem, we fix the problem and we can fix it. So, in the old days when you had a bug on your disk, you had to wait. Maybe there were less, but you had to wait for the next release, which maybe came out, in 3, 6 months, a year down the road. We can fix that immediately, get that out there, and get the problem solved immediately. So we realize we're going to introduce problems, but we can fix those problems quickly, and that allows us, and with good conscience, to release maybe some features that might have some bugs in it. Right? Yes.
What tools are you using in the Scrum side, and then is the data coming to the project management side through some other tool, or is it just user input?
Okay. So today we use version 1 as our Scrum management system. We are in the process of going back to Jira. So we used Jira a couple years ago. We moved to version 1 and we're going back to Jira, only because Jira is a good general purpose tool that works across all of our organizations from the support, services, and development, where version 1 really is focused towards development. And so that's what we use today. And no, there isn't good integration between the different systems. So one of the good things about Jira is that we have a database that we can pull this information out of, massage it, and put it into some other system and do this reporting. Version 1, we buy it as a software as a service. So only thing we can get the data is through the reporting structure they have or through their API. And so we're limited on the type of analysis and importing and we can do to other project management tools. Okay? Yeah.
One more. The resource loading question is always coming up on our so the project plans, are you doing the whole team resource loading on there? Or do you try and talk
So at Alchemy, we do not do the project management aspect here, right? We are, I've got good bean counters that allow me to not commit to what they need to do. So what I've been able to, the reason I'm able to do that is because I'm able to say that with these number of developers, I can generate this much work product, and that much work product can deliver this many, can implement this many customers and do this much work. And so based on that, I've equated work to developers, and the company has equated revenue to implementations, right? So if you give me 5 developers, I can do X number of implementations during the year. And so the company, as they scale up, their cost is, okay, I'll give you 5 more developers, but what you're committing is to be able to deliver this many implementations. So that's how I solved this problem. At Rovi, though, I did do resourcing, but I always put my resource plans without names, right? I go and say, how many developers do I need? How many different QA do I need? Whatever product managers do I need? And I lay out my project plans just with resource names. And then from the standpoint of developing the funding model that I need to get this approved, you know, I now have the time, I need the number of resources, and then how we get those resources then becomes now a resourcing problem after we do it. In the case of Rovi, you have teams all over the world. Maybe they were in China, maybe they were in Russia, and we would go through and figure out where are we going to get those resources and doing it. At Alchemy, it's a much smaller problem, easier to solve. Okay? Well, one more.
So you have your team located in the same?
At Alchemy, we're all in Plano. Yep. Great.
I had one question about the Kanban-ish.
Okay.
When someone finishes a task, they just go pull the little card off the Kanban table. What if they decide they need 2 or 3 more people to help them get it done?
Well, so the teams are always self-organized. So that's one of the things even in Scrum is the concept is that teams are self-organized, and if they need help, they find help. And that's what they do in our organization. So maybe they'll pull off a ticket, and it's more work than one person can do. Maybe you need somebody to go work on a database. Maybe you need somebody to go work on the web services. Maybe you need somebody to go and do the UI. So our tickets can have multiple names on them and be assigned to multiple different people. Then the task breakdown that we have can be assigned to different people to do different things. So this person will be assigned a task to work on the database. This person will be assigned a task to work on the service. This person will be assigned a task to work on the web service. And then they work between them and collaborate between them of what they need to do. So the whole point is I've got to break down into smaller units that all manage themselves. I can't manage 40 people. And so it breaks down and they all manage themselves, and I hire good, smart people that solve problems. Thank you very much. All right,
Great.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Got a little gifty for you from the Dell. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all very much for coming. Have a great summer.